I'm John Tickles, and welcome to the first installment of Remote RPGs. Now, I know the very first thing you're thinking. Is that mustache real? Yes. Yes, it is. So, let's get back to RPGs. Now, if you're a fan of RPGs, you know what to expect. A long, winding story, interesting characters, staring at a random number generator hoping that it doesn't screw you over yet again. With the hundreds or maybe thousands of RPGs that have been sent out, not all of them are going to be as popular as your Pokemons or your Final Fantasies. And that's what this show looks to do. This show looks to find those little games that fell through the cracks. Maybe the ones that were heard about, maybe talked about a little, not remembered though. But this show looks to rectify that. Rectify. It's funny because it sounds like rectum. But I jest. Anyway, let's talk about the first RPG, Live-A-Live, for the SNES or Super Famicom. Live-A-Live. Released in 1994, this was one of the few games that RPG monolith, Square, decided not to bring over to North America. The premise of the game is that you play 7 separate stories, each with their own characters and scenarios, kind of like Saga Frontier for the PlayStation. And this is where Live-A-Live truly shines with its incredibly unique and absolutely original stories. You have a story about a caveman in prehistoric times with dinosaurs and a comical tone. A story about a young ninja in feudal Japan who secures precious artifacts and has an extremely difficult journey. Plays an old kung fu master teaching his techniques to a young student, stressing that you must use your mind.
Not everything is as simple.
Oh, I'm going home, man.
The story of a lone cowboy in the Wild West who wanders from town to town, protecting others with his incredible gun skills.
What a load of shit.
The story in the present of an underdog who wants to be the best fighter in the world. The slow, futuristic story with a deep philosophical undertone, a suspenseful adventure, and an evil computer that becomes self-aware.
Just what do you think you're doing?
And the story of an orphan teenager from the future with telekinetic powers who fights a secret government organization plotting to liquefy 2,000 human beings, and he uses a giant mechanical robot. Okay, that story's pretty original. Okay, so the settings and characters used in Live-A-Live have been done to death. But for most of the stories, that doesn't stop them from creating an interesting tale, each with their own lesson to teach. And actually, a lot of the stories, like the Kid from the Future, the science fiction chapter, and the Kung Fu Master, all had a pretty diverse tale with many plot twists and even some character development. Each chapter varies in length, ranging from 45 minutes to maybe about 4 hours, depending on if you use a walkthrough. They all have different gameplay styles that keep the playthrough fresh and interesting. Here's a rundown of each of the chapters in the game, in order to my least favorite to the one I enjoyed the most. The rest of the story featured no exploration, just 7 battles, and you choose the order, Street Fighter style. You learn the techniques that the fighters use on you, and the battle system of this game makes the chapter at least playable. However, this is one of the shortest, clocking in at only about 45 minutes, and probably the weakest chapter. The story is really bland and the main hero is really dull. There isn't even any exploration, as I mentioned, little dialogue, and the chapter is just short and uninteresting, but still playable. Caveman's story is interesting because it features no dialogue. The characters communicate using pictures and sounds. This does lead to some pretty funny moments. Now this story talks about caveman and dinosaurs existing at the same time, which is bullshit.
So, as we can see here, the first Homo erectus, haha, Homo erect. But, anyway, the first Homo erectus came over 100,000 years ago. I don't want to learn!
The gimmick of this chapter is that you're able to smell out enemies and battles, which is used pretty well with the gameplay. The chapter has also a lot of minor puzzle solving elements, which aren't very difficult, but not easy enough so you don't have to think about it. which made it a great balance. There was also many characters to play in this chapter. This one was enjoyable, but the story was just too simple for me. But still, pretty fun. In the ninja story, you have to work your way through an area filled with guards, traps, and difficult moral decisions. The interesting thing about this chapter is that you can choose to become one with the shadows and sneak past all 100 guards without taking a life. Or you can be less subtle of a ninja than Naruto and be less sneaky than a herd of elephants carrying 1,000 drumming drummers and ex-girlfriends, carrying neon signs, running through a minefield on national television. Yeah, I couldn't find that one on Google Images. Anyway, it doesn't really pay to sneak through all the enemies in the long run because it's much more useful to just level up for the final battle anyway. This chapter was also the hardest, with many traps that will quickly introduce you to the game over screen more than once. I'd suggest using a walkthrough for this one. The cowboy story features a few battles and a short story, and freaking Clint Eastwood. I mean, look at it, they're not even trying to hide it. Okay, look, Clint Eastwood, fistful of dollars. The cowboy from Liverpool. Exact same, even the cigarette and the 5 o'clock shadow, it's the exact same, but who am I to complain? Who doesn't want to see more Clint Eastwood? Well, anyway, the cowboy story mostly features on just collecting traps and items for a huge final battle with the crazy bunch. The only complaint I really have about this chapter is that they didn't really make it clear how to actually set up the traps. So I just kind of wandered around like an idiot, and then I had to fight the final battle with the enemies at full strength. But I still actually ended up winning somehow, so I guess it's not too big of a flaw. As I mentioned, the story in this chapter is pretty simple and pretty cliched, but to me it's still a lot of fun, especially if you're a Western fan. In the Boy from the Future story, you play as a kid battling against an organization with this giant mecha. You know, a usual Japanese cartoon story. This chapter is great, as the story can range from silly and lighthearted to dark and sometimes even shocking. Besides, just look at what these people are wearing. It's kind of hard to take a guy seriously when he has green spiky hair, wears a revealing vest, and rides a motorcycle. It's kind of like Cloud Stripe's flamboyant brother, Richard! The regular battles were a joke, but the big boss battles of the chapter are way too difficult in comparison. The rest of the chapter was pretty fun, as the main character is able to read people's minds, often leading to some great moments. But the chapter and the character overall are memorable, so I really enjoyed this one in the end. In the Kung Fu chapter, you play as an old master looking to pass his technique on to 3 younger students. You train with these 3, and an interesting thing about this chapter is you have the decision to choose how much you train each person. And you'll be basically buffing up one person for the final battle at the end of the chapter. Like the rest of the game, this chapter features a lot of interesting and pretty funny dialogue, and the story is actually pretty interesting, albeit a lot like The Karate Kid. The science fiction chapter is my favorite. You are a silent robot just made on a transport ship who works towards solving the mystery of what exactly is going on a ship and how to stop these horrible events around you from happening. As the crew of the ship begin to fight amongst themselves, the suspense and terror you feel around you in the chapter are actually incredibly palpable. Like just walking around reminds me of Clock Tower because there's a killer alien wandering the ship, and if he touches you, game over. I can really relate to situations like that. Speaking of walking around, you kind of do a lot of that in this chapter, as there's a lot of moments where you're walking around just trying to find where the plot went. But if you have a walkthrough, it shouldn't be much of a problem. There also aren't any battles in this chapter, save for the final one. Unless you count the mini-game you can play on the side, called Captain Square. Subtle. Anyway, I really love the story in this chapter, as the story slowly unfolds and then accelerates as the horrible events around you happen and they conclude into a stunning climax. You might have to resort to a walkthrough as I mentioned, but it's definitely... I don't want to give away what happens in the final chapter, but the only thing I'm going to say is that you can play as all the heroes in a quest to defeat the final boss. It's about time I talk about the battle system. In Live A Live, you fight on a 7x7 square field where you have the ability to freely move around and attack with separate sets of moves for each character. Every attack has a different range and sometimes side effects. And all in all, it's definitely a lot like Final Fantasy Tactics meets conventional turn-based combat. There are also no random encounters for most of the chapters, and fortunately, Live A Live doesn't really promote grinding until the last chapter, where both random encounters and grinding play a huge role. Another pretty cool thing about the battle system is when someone's HP reaches 0, their body sticks around and you don't need a phoenix down or anything to heal them. All you have to do is use a healing move on them and you can revive them. But the only thing is, if one of the enemies attacks that dead body, that person's gone for the rest of the battle. And also, after battles, your health is automatically replenished, which sounds like it would make the game too easy, but it's actually really balanced. Some battles, even at low levels, you can still win if you strategize. Strategize being another word for being a cheap asshole, like me. Graphics in the game are, well, mixed. Some scenes, like the opening, or when he's running through the desert in the cowboy chapter, are visually pleasing and appropriate for a late SNES Squaresoft RPG. However, some areas, like the city map in the future chapter, were pretty dull and uninspired. It could have used a bit more Mode 7, I don't recall really seeing any. But for the most part, the graphics and animations were quite expressive, and all in all, the graphics did their job. Music was fantastic. I'm usually pretty picky about video game music, but some of these pieces are absolutely excellent. We're not talking Chrono Trigger genius here, but it is iPod worthy. Some of my favorite tracks include Wanderer, Psycho Killer, and the boss theme Megalomaniac. The composer, Yoko Yoko went on to score other fantastic games like Parasite Eve for the PlayStation 1, Super Mario RPG, and the Kingdom Hearts series, just to name a few. So, you're probably wondering, how the hell did you play video games without fingers? But more importantly, why wasn't this game released in North America? Well, if I had to guess, then I'd say it was because Square was already working on more surefire hits, like Chrono Trigger, which required a huge translation and would already be released 5 months later. Also, this game would take a lot of translation work to make the jokes work, and a lot of censoring. Trust me, knowing how strict Nintendo was about having blood in a Mortal Kombat game, they probably wouldn't touch Live A Live with a 10-foot pole unless a lot of work was put into it. Don't let the cutesy graphics fool you. Live A Live is dark. In fact, darker than many other RPGs that I've ever played. So by no means is Live A Live a masterpiece. But that's not the point. Live A Live is a game unlike anything you've ever played before. It has something for everybody. Kinda like Walmart. It has a great battle system, 7 stories with different gameplay styles, great music, and really, what more can you ask for? It even has multiple endings, and I think that's a year before Chrono Trigger did it. Well, thank you all for watching the first episode of Remote RPGs. I'm John Tickles, and I look forward to our next random encounter.